June 1944, Ypsilanti, Michigan. Ford Willow Run, Line 3. A B-24 Liberator rolls off the final jig, its aluminum skin still cool from the assembly bay, 4 propellers hanging motionless in the summer air. An inspection stamp hits wet ink on the acceptance form, the sound sharp against the background hum of pneumatic tools and conveyor systems. Outside on the tarmac, finished bombers queue in diagonal rows, their fuselages gleaming under afternoon sun, and their instrument panels waiting for hands that haven't arrived yet. The test crews aren't there yet, and the ferry pilots are still hours away, caught in a schedule that can't quite match the rhythm of what's happening inside this building. These weren't built by the men who would fly them into combat over Europe and the Pacific. They were built by the Liberty women, the 4 women who managed entire production sections. The 60,000 hands across a single plant, working 3 shifts around the clock, representing 40% of the assembly line by mid-1944 and 70% of final inspection stations. This is not a story about sacrifice, though there was plenty of that. But this is a story about cadence, the industrial rhythm that determined whether aircrafts reached squadrons in time to matter, whether replacement bombers outnumbered combat losses, and whether the mathematics of a long war tilted toward one side or collapsed under its own logistical weight. World War II air power hinged not just on aces in cockpits, but on rhythm. A production cadence paced by women on factory floors, who never fired a gun but determined how many guns could be fired. The shift badge clipped to a collar at the plant gate, its metal edge worn smooth from months of daily handling. Oil-stained gloves folded carefully in a locker, the leather cracked at the knuckles from gripping bucking bars and drill housings. A childcare ticket punched at the plant nursery gate, the timestamp reading 10:35 p.m. as a mother hands her sleeping child to a night attendant. The 10:48 p.m. bus pulling up to the Ford Willow Run stop, its headlights cutting through Michigan darkness, carrying the graveyard shift toward another 8 hours of repetition and precision. These were the instruments of industrial speed, unglamorous and essential, invisible to anyone who only saw the finished bomber on a newsreel. By mid-1944, American factories were finishing heavy bombers faster than flight crews could ferry them to modification depots on the coast, faster than the war could immediately consume them, even with sortie rates climbing and attrition running high over defended airspace. The bottleneck wasn't aluminum, which flowed from smelters in steady tonnage. It wasn't engines, which Pratt and Whitney and Wright produced in sufficient numbers. The bottleneck was human capacity. The time required to train a 10-man crew to function as a single organism under combat stress. The hours needed to fly an aircraft from Michigan to Georgia and then across the Atlantic. The physical limit of how many aircraft a modification depot could process in a week, even when running at full capacity. Factories built cadence before they built planes, constructing the system that would enable speed long before the first rivets were driven, or the first wings were jigged into position. Walk onto the floor in early 1942, when Willow Run was still ramping up production, and most of the workforce had just arrived from farms, retail counters, teaching positions, and households where manufacturing experience meant operating a sewing machine. New hires, many of whom had never held a pneumatic tool or read a technical blueprint, faced a machine that had never existed at this scale before. The B-24 Liberator was not a simple aircraft. 4 engines generating 4,800 horsepower, 10 crew positions distributed from nose to tail, 65 feet of wingspan, 18,000 rivets in the fuselage alone, hydraulic systems, electrical harnesses, oxygen lines, and control cables that all had to integrate perfectly, or the aircraft wouldn't fly. No one had built them at industrial volume, no one had developed proven training protocols for semi-skilled labor, and no one had certainty that the whole system would function under the pressure of wartime production quotas that kept climbing. The training started not with the aircraft, but with modular systems that broke complexity into manageable repetition. Identical jigs positioned components in exactly the same orientation every time. Identical fixtures held sub-assemblies at consistent angles and heights. Identical processes repeated down the line, so that a woman assigned to Station 14 in the fuselage section didn't need to understand the entire bomber. She needed to understand Station 14. That meant mastering drill pattern C7, applying torque specifications 45 inch-pounds to every fastener, maintaining rivet spacing per the template clipped to her workstation, and executing those operations again and again until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The learning curve was mathematical and measurable. It followed industrial principles that had been observed in other mass production environments, but had never been applied to something as complex as a 4-engine heavy bomber. Each time cumulative output doubled, from 10 aircraft to 20, from 20 to 40. The hours required per aircraft dropped by 15 to 20%. Workers refined techniques, identified inefficiencies, and developed shortcuts that didn't compromise quality. Willow Run's first B-24 took 40,000 man-hours to complete, a staggering figure that included all the fumbling and trial and error of an untested production line. By 1944, after the learning curve had flattened and the systems had stabilized, the plant was finishing one bomber every 63 minutes, a rate that seemed impossible when viewed from the early days, but became routine through systematic training and process refinement. The smile test for flush rivets became second nature to every riveter on the line. Run a fingernail across the seam where aluminum skin met aluminum frame. If the nail catches on a protruding rivet head, you sand it down and remeasure until it sits perfectly flush. The distinctive click of a go-no-go gauge sliding over a drilled hole told an experienced worker whether the diameter met specification without needing to consult a chart or call an inspector. Swapping a bucking bar mid-run because the access angle changed from one rivet to the next was the kind of micro-adjustment that shaved seconds from each operation. Those seconds compounded into minutes. That compounded into the difference between 1 bomber per shift and 3 bombers per shift. Standardized practices eliminated variance, which was the enemy of both speed and quality in mass production environments. Torque charts were posted at every pneumatic station, laminated and updated whenever engineering specifications changed. Drill templates hung on shadow boards outlined in paint so that a missing tool was immediately visible. Color-coded bins organized fasteners by function. Red bins held structural rivets that bore primary loads. Blue bins contained secondary fasteners for non-critical attachments. Yellow bins meant inspection hold, parts that needed verification before installation. Rework rates had been catastrophically high in early production runs. They dropped month over month as training improved and inspection protocols tightened. First pass yield. The percentage of components that passed inspection without requiring correction climbed from the low 60s to the high 80s. That margin represented the difference between a production line that barely functioned and one that set records. Blueprint classes ran during lunch breaks. Experienced forewomen taught new hires how to read orthographic projections, interpret datum lines, and understand the relationship between a two-dimensional drawing and a three-dimensional assembly. They demonstrated techniques on scrap aluminum before shifts started, showing the correct angle for a drill approach or the proper pressure for a bucking bar. Inspectors walked the line with calipers and sample books, teaching not just the what, but the why. They explained that a rivet driven at the wrong angle created stress concentrations that could lead to fatigue cracks under flight loads. A mis-torqued bolt might hold under normal conditions, but fail catastrophically during combat maneuvers. The system didn't demand heroism or exceptional individual talent. It demanded repetition with precision, consistency across thousands of operations, and the discipline to execute the same task correctly on the 500th repetition as on the first. Speed is an effort or willpower or individual determination, overcoming obstacles through sheer force of character. Speed is architecture, the deliberate design of systems that remove friction, eliminate wasted motion, and allow human capacity to focus on skilled work rather than logistical obstacles. Willow Run opened an on-site nursery in 1943. A significant portion of the workforce consisted of mothers who couldn't work 8-hour shifts if childcare wasn't available, reliable, and synchronized with production schedules. The nursery had capacity for 700 children and operated around the clock, matching the plant's 3-shift rotation. A mother on the graveyard shift could drop her child at 10:30 p.m., work until 7 a.m., and pick up a fed, rested, and supervised child on the way to the bus stop, without needing to coordinate with relatives. The alternative to this system was missed shifts. Missed shifts meant gaps in production crews, which meant disrupted station rhythms. This meant slower output and higher defect rates, as less experienced workers filled in temporarily. The plant ran dedicated bus lines, radiating out from Ypsilanti on 15 routes that connected to residential neighborhoods, boarding houses, and war housing projects where workers lived. The buses were timed to shift changes with precision, arriving 10 minutes before the shift started and departing 15 minutes after it ended. Workers without personal automobiles, which was most of them, could reach the plant reliably without depending on irregular public transit or carpooling arrangements that fell apart when someone got sick or reassigned. The canteen served hot meals 24 hours a day, subsidized by the company to the point where a full meal cost less than it would take to pack a lunch at home. The food was basic but adequate. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, coffee that stayed hot in industrial urns. Line workers didn't leave the plant for lunch. That would have meant walking to the gate, waiting in line to clock out, finding food somewhere in town, and reversing the process to clock back in. A procedure that could consume an entire 30-minute break and leave the worker rushed, tired, and unfed. Lunch came to them, delivered on trays at their stations if they were on a critical timing section, served in the canteen if they had time to walk over. Ergonomic fixtures reduced physical fatigue. Fatigue accumulated over 8-hour shifts and degraded both speed and quality in the final hours when workers were tired and mistakes became more frequent. Adjustable work stands allowed women of different heights to position components at comfortable working levels without stooping or reaching overhead for extended periods. Rotating jigs brought the fuselage section to the worker instead of forcing her to climb inside cramped spaces with awkward angles. This slowed work and increased the risk of injury from slips or tool drops. Pneumatic tools were gradually redesigned with triggers sized for smaller hands and grips that didn't require excessive force to maintain control. These changes happened only after initial tool batches proved difficult to operate, and workers complained loudly enough that management couldn't ignore the inefficiency. Inspectors worked in line rather than at the end of the production sequence, a critical design choice that caught defects early when they were cheap and fast to fix. A defect caught at Station 8, a misdrilled hole, a rivet driven at the wrong angle, a torque specification missed, cost minutes to correct. The component was still accessible. The tools were nearby, and the worker who made the mistake was still at the station and could learn from immediate feedback. A defect caught at final assembly, after the fuselage had been closed up, and multiple subsequent operations had been completed on top of the error, cost hours. The aircraft had to be pulled from the line, disassembled partially, corrected, reassembled, and reinspected, disrupting the flow and creating bottlenecks downstream. The red reject tag was a tool, not a punishment, and inspectors who used it appropriately were protecting the production schedule from much larger delays later. Pay envelopes arrived weekly, in cash, with deductions clearly itemized so workers could see exactly what they'd earned and what had been withheld for taxes and war bond purchases. War bond posters lined the walls with slogans about supporting the troops and financing victory. Many workers diverted a percentage of their pay directly into bonds, partly from patriotism and partly because there wasn't much to buy, with discretionary income given wartime consumer goods shortages. Peer training circles formed organically during breaks. Experienced workers coached new hires on tricks that didn't appear in the training manual. How to position your body weight behind a rivet gun to reduce arm fatigue. Which drill bit brands held their edge longer. How to tell from the sound whether a pneumatic connection was leaking pressure. At peak production months in 1944, American factories were finishing heavy bombers faster than flight crews could immediately ferry them to operational theaters. This created a backlog that represented not failure, but the inversion of the usual wartime constraint, where demand exceeded supply. The evidence for this claim lived on backlog boards inside ferry command offices, where aircraft awaiting test flights and delivery assignments were tracked with handwritten serial numbers. Flight test schedules stacked 3 days deep. Newly completed bombers waited for check pilots to verify that engines ran smoothly, control surfaces responded correctly, and hydraulic systems held pressure under simulated load. Calls went out for additional pilots qualified to conduct acceptance tests. The Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASP, who were flying every type of aircraft in the American inventory on non-combat missions to free up male pilots for combat duty, were assigned to ferry runs in increasing numbers. Still, the aircraft accumulated faster than they could be moved. Willow Run's delivery apron in June 1944 held rows of completed B-24 Liberators staged on grass strips beside the main taxiway, parked wingtip to wingtip in diagonal lines that stretched toward the perimeter fence. Protective paper remained taped over plexiglass nose cones to prevent scratches during ground handling. Desiccant plugs were installed in pitot tubes to prevent moisture accumulation in static pressure systems. Engines were pickled with preservation oil formulated for short-term storage. The process took 30 minutes per engine and required draining before flight, but was necessary because no one knew exactly when each aircraft would depart. These weren't damaged aircraft waiting for repair or defective aircraft waiting for rework. They were complete, airworthy, accepted bombers waiting for someone to fly them away. The modification depots, massive facilities on the east and west coasts, where bombers received final combat equipment, including gun turrets, armor plating, bombing computers, and theater-specific radio fits, reported queues that stretched their capacity. The depots could process 30 aircraft per week when running at full capacity. All modification bays occupied and all shifts staffed. The factories were delivering 45 aircraft per week. That gap of 15 bombers represented not a production shortfall, but a logistics mismatch, where the downstream system couldn't absorb upstream output. Training bases faced the same mathematical constraint, though theirs was measured in human months rather than aircraft movements. A heavy bomber crew required extensive coordinated training before they were ready for combat operations. Pilot and co-pilot learning emergency procedures and formation flying. Navigator mastering celestial and dead reckoning techniques. Bombardier training on the Norden bomb site. Flight engineer understanding fuel management and systems troubleshooting. Radio operator practicing Morse code and frequency management. 6 gunners learning to track targets and clear jams under stress. 10 men learning to function as one organism, making decisions in fractions of a second, trusting each other with their lives. You couldn't rush that training without producing crews that would die quickly in combat. But you could rush aluminum through a factory line, and the result was an inventory of aircraft that arrived before the crews who would fly them were ready. By late 1944, the United States was producing more heavy bombers per month than Nazi Germany had managed to build in total since 1939. B-17, B-24, and later B-29. Germany was still gearing up when the war started, expecting a short conflict. The American advantage wasn't stronger workers, or longer hours, or superior individual craftsmanship. The advantage was faster systems, better training protocols, smarter logistics, and the recognition that industrial warfare was won by whoever could sustain output at scale over years without collapsing from resource exhaustion or organizational chaos. Speed held not despite quality standards, but because quality lived at each station, embedded in the process as a non-negotiable requirement rather than an afterthought or final inspection catch. Gauge blocks sat on every assembly bench within arm's reach of the worker. Metal reference standards ground to tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch, calibrated monthly, used to verify that drilled holes, machined surfaces, and fitted components met specification. A drilled hole wasn't close enough, or probably fine, or acceptable based on visual judgment. It was 0.251 inches in diameter, verified with a gauge that either fit or didn't, with no ambiguity and no room for interpretation. If the gauge didn't fit, the hole was rejected, reamed to correct diameter if undersized, or the part was scrapped and replaced if oversized. Stamp marks told a traceable story that survived as long as the aircraft did. Each inspector carried a unique identifier stamp, a metal punch engraved with a code number or initial set, and every component that passed their station received that mark in permanent ink or light, stamping on a non-critical surface. A stamped acceptance meant that individuals' reputation and employment rode on every rivet, every torque specification, every dimensional check under their jurisdiction. The stamps were auditable, traceable back through production records. If a bomber failed in the field due to a manufacturing defect, a cracked spar, a miswired circuit, a hydraulic line that ruptured under pressure, the plant could trace the failure back to the specific station, the specific shift, and the specific worker who had signed off on that component. This created accountability that couldn't be deflected or obscured. First pass yield, the percentage of components that passed inspection without requiring rework or correction, improved month over month as training matured and workers internalized quality standards. Early 1942, when the line was still finding its rhythm and mistakes were frequent. 62% first pass yield, meaning that more than a third of all work required some level of correction. Mid-1944, after 2 years of learning curve and process refinement. 89% first pass yield, meaning that only 1 in 9 components needed additional attention. That margin of 27 percentage points was the difference between a production line that barely functioned and one that set records. Between a factory that struggled to meet quota and one that exceeded it by 40%. Women inspectors had developed expertise that exceeded their male supervisors after months of repetitive exposure to the same defects and failure modes. They red-tagged spar cracks that were invisible to the naked eye, but showed up under magnification as stress concentrations that would propagate under flight loads. They rejected misdrilled skins that would have held together under normal loads and passed a casual inspection, but would fail under combat stress when the aircraft maneuvered violently, or took battle damage that transferred loads through compromised structures. They caught pattern defects. The same error repeated across an entire batch of sub-assemblies because a fixture had shifted or a drill template had been damaged. Production stopped immediately until the root cause was identified and corrected. They accepted the short-term schedule hit to prevent a much larger problem when dozens of defective components reached final assembly. Rework boards tracked discrepancies by type, by station, by shift, and by individual worker when patterns emerged. The boards weren't punitive tools designed to shame workers or justify terminations. They were diagnostic instruments that revealed where the system was failing and needed adjustment. If station 22 showed a spike in mistorqued bolts over 3 consecutive shifts, the response wasn't to blame the workers, but to check whether the torque wrench needed calibration or whether the specification chart had been updated. If wing shop B showed elevated reject rates compared to wing shop A, despite using identical processes and equipment, the response was systematic. Recalibrate the fixtures, verify that drill bits were being replaced at the correct intervals, and observe both shops side by side to identify subtle differences in technique that weren't captured in written procedures. The goal was never perfection, which was unattainable in mass production environments where human error was inevitable and fixturing tolerances had physical limits. The goal was consistency. Repeatable processes that produce repeatable results within acceptable variation. Consistency enabled speed because workers could execute operations automatically without constant supervision or measurement. Speed enabled volume because aircraft moved through the line at predictable intervals without piling up at bottleneck stations. Volume enabled air power because squadrons received aircraft faster than combat and accidents could destroy them. Cadence has a face, though it's rarely the face shown in recruiting posters or newsreels. 3 faces, in fact, each representing a different role in the production sequence and a different path into war work. Portrait A, the Riveter, Final Assembly. Station 31. She arrived at Willow Run in March 1943 from a small town in central Michigan. She'd worked as a clerk in a general store, a job that required no physical labor beyond stocking shelves and gave her no preparation for what she was about to encounter. 2 weeks of classroom training introduced her to blueprint symbols that might as well have been hieroglyphics at first. Section views showing internal structure, datum lines establishing reference planes, fastener callouts specifying rivet types and spacing requirements. Then the floor, where theory met reality in the form of noise, speed, and unforgiving aluminum that didn't care whether you were ready. Her station assignment put her on lower fuselage skin panels, a critical section where the integrity of every rivet determined whether the structure would hold under flight loads or develop fatigue cracks that could lead to catastrophic failure. 4 operations repeated in endless sequence. Drill the hole through both skin and frame, using a template to ensure correct spacing. Insert the rivet while the hole was still clean. Position the bucking bar against the back side of the rivet while holding it firmly enough to resist the hammer blows, but not so firmly that it couldn't absorb the impact. Then trigger the pneumatic gun for a 3-second burst that mushroomed the rivet head and drew the 2 pieces of aluminum together with enough clamping force to bear structural loads. If the bucking bar slipped even slightly, the rivet deformed asymmetrically and had to be drilled out and replaced. This cost time and disrupted the rhythm. 300 rivets per shift, 840 shifts if she lasted a year, 252,000 rivets driven if she made no mistakes and never called in sick. She learned the rhythm gradually, first consciously thinking through each step, then moving through the sequence without deliberate thought as muscle memory took over. Drill the hole, feeling the bit break through the back side. Slide the rivet into position before metal shavings could fall into the hole. Position the bar, left hand bracing it while the right hand lifted the gun. 3-second burst, the pneumatic hammer rattling her arm from wrist to shoulder. Check with the fingernail, running it across the seam to verify that the rivet sat flush. Next rivet 18 inches along the frame line. By June, 3 months into the job, she hit tack time for the first time in a complete shift. The target cycle duration per operation that the industrial engineers had calculated based on total aircraft completion time divided by number of operations. The forewoman marked it on the shift board with her badge number and the date. By August, she was training others, demonstrating the correct angle and pressure, explaining the fingernail test and what it meant when the rivet felt slightly raised versus perfectly smooth. Portrait B, the inspector, wing shop, first shift. A war widow whose husband's destroyer had gone down off Guadalcanal in late 1942. The ship took him and 237 other sailors to the bottom of the Pacific in the middle of the night when a Japanese torpedo found the magazine. She took the job at Willow Run in early 1943, not because she needed the income immediately. The Navy death benefit and her husband's back pay provided a cushion. But sitting at home alone with photographs and memories was unbearable. Doing something that contributed to winning the war felt like the only meaningful response to what had been taken from her. She carried the red reject tag, a laminated card attached to a wire loop that she could hang on any component that failed to meet specification. It was the most feared object on the production floor. A red tag stopped the line, triggered a review that pulled in supervisors and engineers, and meant that someone else's work didn't pass inspection. Often someone she knew by name. Someone she ate lunch with. Someone who was trying just as hard as she was. She hated using it. Hated the confrontation and the disappointment and the time pressure of falling behind schedule. But she used it when she had to, because the alternative was aircraft that failed in combat. And she'd already lost one person to this war and wasn't going to contribute to losing more by letting defective work pass just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. July 1944. Midway through her shift, a batch of 11 wing spars arrived from the overnight crew for final inspection before moving to assembly. 10 looked clean on visual examination. No obvious cracks, no surface defects, no discoloration indicating heat damage from welding. The 11th had something that caught her eye. A hairline crack near the attachment lug where bolts would connect the wing to the fuselage, barely visible under the fluorescent shop lights, but definitely there when she looked closely. She pulled the entire batch, rather than just the one suspect spar, reasoning that if one part from a production run had a defect, others might have similar issues from the same root cause. She inspected all 11 under magnification using a handheld lens, taking 15 minutes per spar, falling further behind schedule with each inspection, but unwilling to take chances. Found 2 more cracks in different spars, similar location, similar appearance. Stress patterns indicating that a drill bit had been worn past its service life and was creating rough holes that concentrated loads instead of distributing them. The batch was scrapped. 11 spars representing 4 hours of labor and several $100s in material cost. The drill bits at the overnight station were replaced immediately, the entire set rather than just the suspect ones. The overnight crew received additional training on tool inspection and replacement intervals. She saved a day in the schedule, maybe, by catching the problem before those spars reached assembly and had to be removed from completed wings. Maybe she saved a crew. though she'd never know because successful inspections prevented failures that left no trace except in an alternate history where someone made a different choice. Portrait C. The Electrician. Systems Installation. Night Shift. She had taken night classes in electrical theory before the war, not for any career purpose, but because she found it intellectually interesting. The way circuits worked and current flowed and components interacted in ways that were logical and predictable once you understood the underlying principles. When Willow Run opened an advanced training track for electrical systems installation, targeting workers who showed aptitude and interest in moving beyond basic assembly operations, she applied immediately. She was accepted into a 6-week program that covered aircraft-specific electrical systems, wire routing standards, circuit testing procedures, and troubleshooting methodology. Her station assignment put her in systems installation, the section where hundreds of wires were threaded through the fuselage after the structure was complete but before the interior fittings were installed. Each aircraft had miles of wiring, interphone circuits connecting crew stations, turret motor circuits powering defensive guns, navigation light harnesses, instrument panel connections, radio antenna leads, auxiliary power systems. Each wire was color-coded according to a standard scheme, numbered with tags at both ends, routed through protective conduit to prevent abrasion against sharp metal edges, secured with clamps at regular intervals to prevent vibration-induced fatigue failures. A miswired interphone circuit meant the pilot couldn't communicate with the tail gunner. This could be fatal in combat when coordination during attacks was essential. A miswired turret motor meant a defensive gun that didn't traverse or elevate, leaving a blind spot that enemy fighters could exploit. A misrouted wire that rubbed against a fuselage frame could wear through its insulation over time and create a short circuit that drained batteries, or, worse, caused an electrical fire. March 1944, a problem emerged across a batch of 10 aircraft that had completed systems installation and moved to power-up testing. The stage where electrical systems were energized for the first time to verify that everything functioned correctly before the aircraft was accepted. All 10 developed the same fault, an intermittent short in the auxiliary power circuit that caused voltage drops and tripped circuit breakers randomly. Testing crews traced the fault to a grounding issue somewhere in the wire harness. But the root cause was unclear, and the fault didn't appear consistently, which made it difficult to isolate. She volunteered to investigate, walking the line systematically and tracing wire runs across all 10 aircraft, checking routing paths, examining clamp installations, looking for any common factor that might explain why the same problem appeared in every aircraft from the same production batch. Found it on the 6th aircraft, a metal burr inside a conduit clamp, sharp enough to abrade wire insulation under vibration, creating an intermittent ground path that appeared and disappeared as the wire moved. She fixed the short across all 10 aircraft in a single shift, rerouting the affected harness section to avoid the burr location, deburring the clamps with a file, wrapping the wire with additional insulation at stress points, logged the corrective action in the production journal with enough detail that the next month's production manual included an updated installation procedure specifying deburred clamps and additional clearance checks. The production line wasn't the sanitized image presented in recruiting posters and newsreels, where smiling women worked in spotless environments with perfect tools and supportive supervision. It was politics, muscle, friction, and the slow, grinding negotiation between what the system needed and what the system was willing to provide. walked the floor in early 1942, when the plant was just ramping up. The workforce composition was shifting rapidly from the pre-war norm of exclusively male production workers to a mixed environment that no one had experience managing. Some foremen had spent decades in manufacturing and had internalized assumptions about who could handle physically demanding work. They didn't believe women could operate pneumatic tools that vibrated violently and required sustained grip strength. They assigned female workers to what they considered light work: fabric covering on control surfaces, paint touch-up, parts cleaning, roles that kept them away from primary assembly operations and effectively created a segregated production stream where women did finishing work and men did structural assembly. The women pushed back, sometimes individually by demonstrating competency and refusing to accept limitations, sometimes collectively through union representatives who pointed out that excluding half the workforce from critical operations created bottlenecks that threatened production targets. The foremen adjusted their assumptions, slowly and unevenly, more quickly when labor shortages left them no choice, more slowly when they could maintain old patterns through selective assignment and scheduling. The tools were sized for hands that were, on average, larger than women's hands. The tools had been designed in an era when the expected user was always male, and ergonomic variation wasn't a design consideration. The first wave of pneumatic rivet guns delivered to Willow Run had grips that were too wide for comfortable operation by workers with smaller hands. This required awkward grip positions that caused fatigue and reduced control precision. Triggers required too much force to actuate, particularly after several hours of continuous use when hand strength was depleted. Women wrapped the handles with friction tape to reduce the effective grip span, an improvised solution that helped but wasn't optimal. Later production runs of tools included ergonomic modifications, smaller grips, lighter trigger springs, better balance. But only after complaints reached management with sufficient volume and persistence that the efficiency loss from poorly fitted tools became impossible to ignore. Facilities were segregated in some plants, following local customs and legal requirements that varied by region and company. Separate break rooms, separate restrooms, separate entrances in some cases, policies that treated integration as a problem to be managed rather than a default state. Black women faced additional barriers that compounded the gender discrimination, hired later than white women as labor shortages became acute, assigned to less skilled roles even when they had equivalent qualifications, excluded from advancement tracks into inspection or forewoman positions, paid less for equivalent work. It took union pressure, federal mandates under Fair Employment Practice Committee rulings, and sheer labor attrition from men being drafted faster than they could be replaced to crack those doors open. And even then, progress was uneven and grudging. Union meetings filled with arguments about seniority systems that hadn't anticipated a massive influx of new workers. Pay equity between workers doing the same job but hired under different contracts. Shift assignments that determined whether you worked days and could see your family or worked nights, and slept while everyone else was awake. Safety briefings revealed the ongoing cost of production speed measured in human damage. Crush injuries from slipped jigs that caught fingers and hands. Cuts from sharp sheet metal edges that required stitches and left scars. Hearing loss from 8-hour shifts in environments where the ambient noise level exceeded safe exposure limits, but hearing protection wasn't mandatory and was often skipped because it interfered with communication, and made it harder to hear equipment malfunctions. Fatigue was chronic, particularly for workers juggling production shifts with household responsibilities. An era when domestic labor hadn't been automated and expectations for women's home roles hadn't adjusted to match their work roles. Turnover was real. People leaving because the work was harder than expected. Because childcare arrangements fell through. Because injuries accumulated. Because the pay didn't compensate for the cost. The poster asked, "Can you do it?" The clock asked, "Can you do it again by 10:12? And again tomorrow? And again next week when your hands ache and your ears ring and you haven't slept more than 5 hours in 3 days?" The answer for most was yes, but the yes was built on friction that never appeared in public narratives. Built on proving competency every single shift to supervisors who watched female workers more closely than male workers, waiting for mistakes that would confirm pre-existing doubts. Built on navigating systems that had been designed without considering that the users might be different from the designers. Built on showing up despite the doubt, despite the inadequate tools, despite the segregated facilities, despite the pay that was better than most women's jobs, but still less than men earn for equivalent work. Despite the knowledge that when the war ended, the gratitude would be brief and the layoff notices would come quickly. Then, despite all the friction and all the obstacles and all the reasons it shouldn't have worked as well as it did, the line clicked. It found a rhythm that felt inevitable, even though it had been constructed piece by piece through thousands of small adjustments and hard-won improvements. August 1944. Willow Run, record month. 432 B-24 Liberators delivered to acceptors in 31 days. One complete bomber rolling off the final jig every 63 minutes, around the clock, 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week. A pace that would have seemed like fantasy when the plant opened 2 years earlier, but now felt routine to workers who had internalized the rhythm and the procedures and the muscle memory required to sustain it. The internal memo from plant management, posted on bulletin boards throughout the facility, specifically congratulated the midnight shift for closing a quality gap that had plagued the overnight crew for months. Their reject rates had been consistently higher than day and swing shifts, partly because of lighting issues, and partly because the overnight foreman had less experience, and partly because fatigue hit harder when you were working against your circadian rhythm. They'd fixed it through better training, improved lighting at critical stations, and a rotation system that prevented anyone from working permanent midnights for more than 3 months at a time. A newspaper photographer from the Detroit Free Press captured the moment in an image that ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. 40 women standing under the wing of a freshly completed B-24, tools still in hand, shift badges visible on their collars, faces showing fatigue and satisfaction in equal measure. The photo wasn't staged for publicity purposes. The photographer had been touring the plant as part of a war production feature and happened to be present when the final bomber of a record-breaking week came off the line. The women were real workers from Station Group 7, the final assembly section. Not models hired for their photogenic qualities. Their names were listed in the caption, though most newspapers that reprinted the photo cropped the caption or replaced it with generic language about women war workers that erased their individual identities. Hours per aircraft had been cut in half from the early production runs, when the learning curve was steep and mistakes were frequent, and the processes hadn't been optimized. The learning curve had flattened as cumulative volume increased. The gains from each additional aircraft produced became smaller, but still measurable. The systems had stabilized. Training protocols were proven. Tool designs were refined. Inspection procedures were standardized. Support infrastructure from childcare to transportation was operating smoothly. Muscle memory had replaced conscious thought for most operations. This allowed workers to execute their tasks automatically while maintaining the alertness needed to catch anomalies and potential problems before they became actual problems. The celebration lasted exactly one shift. 8 hours of slightly relaxed supervision. Congratulatory handshakes from plant management making their rare appearances on the floor. A brief mention in the shift change announcement over the loudspeakers. Then Lean 3 started the next bomber. The production schedule didn't pause for celebration. The war didn't care about records except insofar as those records translated into aircraft reaching operational squadrons that needed them desperately. Cadence reshaped the air war's mathematics. It changed the fundamental calculation that determined whether strategic bombing campaigns could be sustained in the face of combat losses, whether air superiority could be achieved through sheer numerical advantage when technological parity existed between opposing forces. Ferry routes ran from the industrial Midwest to coastal modification depots in a carefully choreographed dance of logistics. Movement that matched the factory's relentless output. Willow Run to the modification center at Omaha, where aircraft received initial inspection and minor adjustments. Omaha to Birmingham, where armament installation happened in specialized facilities with the equipment and expertise to handle sensitive bombing computers and gun turret mechanisms. Birmingham to Hunter Field in Georgia, where final modifications were completed and aircraft received their overseas deployment preparation. Additional fuel tanks, survival equipment, tropical or cold weather modifications, depending on destination theatre. Hunter to overseas staging bases in England or North Africa or the Pacific Islands. Multi-day flights with stops for fuel and crew rest. Navigation legs that tested whether the aircraft really worked as designed under sustained operation rather than brief test flights. The modification depots reported persistent queues throughout 1944, a backlog that represented the mismatch between factory output and depot throughput capacity. Aircraft waited in holding areas for modification slots to open up, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks when parts shortages or manpower constraints created bottlenecks. Modification centers improvised expansion by setting up outdoor work areas where weather permitted, hiring additional workers from local labor markets, establishing night shifts where they'd previously only worked days, implementing triage systems that prioritized aircraft destined for urgent operational needs over those headed to training or reserve units. But even with those expansions, the depots couldn't process bombers as fast as the factories delivered them, which meant inventory accumulated at every stage of the pipeline from factory floor to combat squadron. Squadron diaries from late 1944 recorded the surplus with a mixture of satisfaction and logistical frustration. More birds than bunks was a common phrase. Squadrons receiving replacement aircraft had more bombers assigned than they had crews qualified to fly them, or maintenance personnel to service them, or hard-stand parking spots to keep them dispersed for protection against enemy attack. Mission tempo increased. Squadrons that had previously struggled to field 8 operational bombers for a mission could now launch 12 or 15. Maintaining higher sortie rates even with aircraft damaged and undergoing repair. Target lists expanded, Strategic planners recognized that the constraint wasn't bomber availability, but target identification and weather conditions suitable for visual or radar bombing. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England against targets in Germany and occupied Europe, flew its 1,000th heavy bomber raid in May 1944, a milestone that represented 2 years of sustained operations, building up from small initial raids to the massive formations that characterized the later war period. By October 1944, just 5 months later, the 8th Air Force was flying that many sorties per week, a tenfold increase in operational tempo that was enabled not by better tactics or improved training, but by sheer numerical advantage in available aircraft. The mathematics of attrition warfare shifted decisively. Previously, it had favored Germany's ability to defend its airspace and inflict unsustainable losses on attacking bomber formations. But replacement aircraft now arrived faster than losses accumulated. Germany couldn't replace what was shot down. Their production was constrained by bombing damage to factories, labor shortages, raw material shortages, and the diversion of resources to other urgent military needs. The United States could replace what was shot down and add more on top of losses, maintaining pressure continuously without pause for reconstitution periods. Not through superior tactics, though tactics improved as experience accumulated. Not through better trained pilots, though training quality was high and improving. Through superior cadence. Through industrial systems that produced aircraft faster than they could be consumed even under the intense attrition rates of strategic bombing campaigns, where 5 to 10% of attacking aircraft might be lost on a single mission. They set records that couldn't be hung on walls or displayed in trophy cases. Achievements measured in metrics that were invisible to everyone except the people tracking production statistics and the crews who benefited from having aircraft available when they needed them. An all-woman swing shift at Douglas Long Beach, producing B-17 flying fortresses in parallel with Willow Run's B-24 production. Hit their production targets 3 weeks running in September 1944, despite maintenance issues with several key fixtures that required improvised workarounds. No special recognition beyond a brief mention in the plant newsletter. No ceremony or publicity photographs. The target was simply met, then exceeded. Then the new performance level became the expected baseline for subsequent months. The production schedule was adjusted upward because if they could do it once, they could do it consistently. An inspector's signature stamp appeared on a B-17 delivered from Boeing's Seattle plant in March 1944. A routine acceptance mark on a bomber that was indistinguishable from hundreds of others except for a serial number, 42-31513, that would later appear in mission records and crew diaries. That bomber flew 107 combat missions over Europe across 13 months of operations, surviving flak damage, fighter attacks, emergency landings, and the accumulated stress of repeated combat sorties that destroyed most aircraft well before they reached triple-digit mission counts. The inspector whose stamp appeared on the acceptance paperwork never knew. Had no way of knowing unless she actively tracked serial numbers and cross-referenced them with published mission statistics, which was impossible given that she was inspecting dozens of aircraft per month and the Army Air Forces didn't publicize individual aircraft records during the war. Willow Run's line rate surpassed the original production plan by 40% in the final year of the war, delivering more aircraft per month than the initial Ford engineering estimates had projected as theoretically possible under optimal conditions. The plan had been optimistic when written, based on assumptions about learning curves and efficiency improvements that were educated guesses rather than proven data. Reality exceeded the optimistic projections because the system continuously improved beyond what planners had anticipated, finding efficiencies and solving problems that hadn't been foreseen when the facility was designed. The scoreboard was the schedule, the only metric that truly mattered when the measure of success was whether aircraft reached operational units in time to affect outcomes. Acceptance logs recorded the deliveries in dry, bureaucratic language. Aircraft type, serial number, delivery date, accepting officer signature, destination assignment. Shift rosters recorded the hands that built them. Clock in time, station assignment, clock out time, total hours worked. Mission, tally marks painted on returning bombers, small bomb symbols stenciled near the nose art, one for each completed sortie, were the dividend on thousands of hours of labor. Labor by people who never saw combat and never witnessed the aircraft they had built being used for its designed purpose. When peace came in August 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings, many of the Liberty women were shown the door within weeks. Their wartime service acknowledged briefly and then discarded as the economy transitioned back to peacetime production, and social norms reasserted themselves. VJ Day marked the end of hostilities, but production contracts were cancelled almost immediately as the military halted orders for equipment that was no longer needed. Willow Run scaled down production over a matter of weeks, reducing shifts from 3 to 2 to 1, then shutting down entire production sections as the need for heavy bombers evaporated. Women received layoff notices that were brief and formulaic. Thank you for your service during the national emergency. Your position is no longer required due to reduced production requirements. Your final paycheck will include compensation for unused vacation time. No promise of recall. No assistance with job placement. No recognition that they'd just spent 2 or 3 years building skills that were now considered irrelevant. The Women Air Force Service pilots were disbanded even earlier, in December 1944, before the war in Europe had concluded, and months before Japan's surrender. Victims of political pressure from male pilots who wanted to preserve flying jobs and military officials who had never been comfortable with women flying military aircraft, even in non-combat roles. WASP members received no veteran status, no GI Bill educational benefits, no access to VA health care, no formal recognition of military service. 38 had died in accidents during their service. Flying every type of aircraft in the American inventory, including experimental jets and bombers fresh from the factory that hadn't been fully tested. They were sent home with a telegram thanking them for their contribution and a final paycheck, then erased from official military histories until veterans organizations lobbied for decades to have their service recognized retroactively. Some Liberty women returned to pre-war roles because that's what economic necessity and social pressure demanded. Back to teaching, back to retail work, back to full-time household management, in an era when married women working outside the home was considered unusual and vaguely suspect. Others fought to stay in manufacturing, applying to the reduced number of production jobs that remained after military contracts ended, and finding that preference went to returning veterans under laws that guaranteed re-employment rights. A few became engineers, moving into technical roles that had been closed to women before the war but opened slightly in its aftermath. Though the doors were narrow and the career paths were uncertain, and the pay was lower than male engineers received for equivalent work. Reunions happened decades later, organized by veterans groups and historical societies and women who wanted to connect with others, who'd shared the experience and understood what it had meant. Museum exhibits followed, displaying tools and photographs and production records that documented what had been accomplished. Recognition arrived in pieces. A Congressional Gold Medal in 2010 for the Wasp. Various state and local honors for Rosie the Riveter and the broader category of women war workers. Inclusion in history curricula that had previously focused almost exclusively on military combat operations. But the lessons stayed embedded in industrial practice and military logistics doctrine, embedded in the understanding of how modern wars are won, when they extend beyond brief campaigns and become contests of industrial endurance. The assembly line didn't care about heroics or individual brilliance or inspiring speeches. It cared about whether cycle times were met, whether defect rates stayed within acceptable bounds, whether training protocols produced competent workers faster than attrition removed them, whether the fixtures were calibrated and the tools were maintained and the inspection stamps meant something. It cared about whether the system removed friction or added it. Friction, the invisible tax on every operation that didn't directly add value. Added through poor design, inadequate support, and policies that created obstacles rather than removing them. The pilots who flew those bombers into combat over Germany and Japan were brave, facing flak and fighters and the constant possibility of catastrophic mechanical failure or enemy action that would send them spiraling down in flames or force them to bail out over hostile territory. The navigators who guided them through weather and darkness and electronic countermeasures were highly skilled, using celestial navigation and dead reckoning and radar to find targets and bring their crews home. The gunners who defended the formations were determined, tracking enemy fighters and firing through their approach runs despite fear and cold, and the knowledge that their position was among the most dangerous in the aircraft. But they flew missions because there were always more planes to fly. Because the production cadence ensured that losses could be replaced and squadrons could be expanded. Because operational tempo could increase without pause for reconstitution. Cadence won the production war before the combat war was decided, establishing a numerical advantage so overwhelming that tactical defeats became temporary setbacks. Strategic campaigns could be sustained despite horrific losses, because the pipeline are never emptied. The Liberty women didn't wait for permission, or approval, or recognition. They built the permission into the production schedule. One bomber every 63 minutes. One shift after another. One inspection stamp that meant something. One red reject tag, used when it mattered. One go, no-go gauge that told the truth about whether the work met standard. Pilots flew the missions that changed the course of the war. Liberty women made sure there were always more planes to fly, more missions to launch, more sorties to pressure the enemy, until resistance collapsed under the weight of industrial mathematics.